Hello everyone, my name is Oscar Medina. I'm a PhD student in sustainability education at Prescott College. And this webinar that I'm going to be hosting is on decolonial methodology. So I'm going to walk you guys through a few slides. Some of the highlights of decolonial methodology: it challenges traditional Western ways of knowing and researching, critiques the Western paradigms in research and knowledge production, deconstructs assumptions, motivations, and values that inform Western research practices, challenges positivism, the notion that authentic knowledge is scientific knowledge produced by objective research, opens up the opportunity to conduct research for decolonial projects, and lastly, honors indigenous researchers and their epistemologies. So some of the attributes and original decolonial and origins of decolonial methodology: Western imperialism and decolonization dehumanizes non-Western indigenous people here in the Americas, starting with the invasion of Christopher Columbus in 1492. The need to recognize indigenous ways of knowing and being disrupts the traditional researchers from extracting knowledge and the lived experiences of non-Western indigenous people. And lastly, validates indigenous researchers and their methodological approaches. So today we'll be going over two texts and two scholars. The first scholar that we'll be looking at is Dr. Linda T. Y. Smith. She's a daughter of a Maori anthropologist from New Zealand. She wrote a very famous text in 1999 called Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous People. There's a YouTube link there that you can click on. She gave a really nice lecture at the City University of New York. The other scholar that we're going to be looking at is Dr. Sean Wilson. He is Opasak Wayak Cree, indigenous from Canada. And he wrote a book in 2008, more recently, called Research is Ceremony, Indigenous Research Methods. So let's get into the first text. Professor Smith provides a solid scientific, a good understanding of how scientific research is deeply implicated in the forms of colonialism. Academic disciplines have their roots in Orientalism, other, or what's called Orientalism of the other, and the need to be decolonized. Research has been used by institutions to achieve power. And she also talks about how research can enhance society, and that includes in indigenous people. So her text is known for writing against research, but using research as a powerful tool. Part one of her book focuses on imperialism and the way knowledge and institutions were formed. And then part two of her book focuses on her own community and the traditions and the value knowledges. So the other indigenous researcher that we're looking at is Sean Wilson, and he provides an indigenous research paradigm, and some of the vocabulary that he introduces in his text is ontology, how indigenous people view reality; epistemology, how indigenous people know reality; axology is how indigenous ethics and morals; and lastly, methodology, how indigenous people go about gaining more knowledge. Some of the main points in his book, really important to highlight here. He argues that indigenous research is ceremony, and it's because it's based in reality, and that indigenous researchers develop relationships, and because they develop these relationships, there's a need for accountability, and how researchers hold themselves accountable is through carefully selecting the topics, the methods of data collection, the forms of analysis, and the way the research is going to be presented. So very, very important contributions and points that that Professor Wilson gives in his text. So I put this slide in here because I think the story of Ishii is very important, as to provide an example as to why decolonial methodology is so important. Alfred Kroeber was a cultural anthropologist who built a career from researching Ishii. Ishii was the last indigenous member of the Yaqui tribe in California. The Yaqui tribe had been killed off by European colonial settlers, and in September of 1911, anthropologist Kroeber began using a portable handcrafted phonograph to record Ishii's narrations of traditional Yaqui songs and stories. They named a building after Kroeber. This is where the Department of Anthropology was held at UC Berkeley. This was the campus where I attended in 2003 and where I took my first anthropology course. Ishii, the story of Ishii is important because this is what happens when we don't have decolonial methodology in place, right? This is a perfect example of exploitation, of a researcher coming in and extracting and building a career, and at the expense of an indigenous person, right? And an indigenous community, right? Which Ishii was a part of. So research today, I pulled this quote out from Wilson's book because I think it really spoke to me in terms of the methodological approach that he's proposing. And the quote reads, "We can decide for ourselves what research we want and how that research will be conducted, analyzed, and presented. Your mother helped me to come up with the idea of writing this story for you, and it feels right to me." One of the things that Wilson is doing in his book is he's writing not only for an academic audience, but also for his 3 children. And in his book, he actually, his writing style is broken up into different fonts. An academic font, right, where he explains this is for an academic audience, and then a font that he specifically uses to speak to his children. And that is new. That is something that is powerful, right? Because he is including a way to convey what he has done to his children who are younger. And so I put these pictures in here, and these are 2 pictures of my boys, and they're harvesting their first corn in the front of our yard here in our home in Tucson, Arizona, because these pictures remind me of this is, the importance of how they were able to plant 60-day Tahana Autumn corn in their front yard, and how they were able to water it and then see it grow and then harvest it, right? And then I put a picture of a university classroom and a presentation, because I feel that a lot of times we are caught in these 2 worlds where we have to be indigenous parents, and then we also have to be academics and be able to speak to these 2 audiences. And so I wanted to just talk about those pictures and pull that quote from Wilson. I also wanted to provide an example of decolonial projects, right, that either come out of indigenous movements and organizations that are basically rehumanizing indigenous and colonized people. So the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, which was an indigenous movement that came about in 1994 in the southern state of Chiapas, Mexico, where indigenous farmers basically organized to create sovereign communities. And then also a picture to the right is the Standing Rock gathering that took place in 2016 and 2017. Indigenous people from around the world gathered to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline from being built. That gathering I see also as a decolonial movement, an indigenous decolonial movement. And then an organization that I've been working closely with, Shito, which is an organization that is providing consulting to educators across the nation to rehumanize curriculum and support students, right, through a curriculum that is culturally responsive and humanizing. So those were some of the examples that I thought about as examples of decolonial projects coming out of decolonial methodology. So to summarize, decolonial methodology is a critique of Western scientific approaches that have their roots in colonialism, primarily racist and male-dominated. Decolonial methodology exposes researchers to their biases and forces them to state their positionality because it does not validate the notion of neutrality and objectivity. And then lastly, decolonial methodology validates indigenous epistemology and allows for an indigenous research agenda to materialize. So I listed a few of the resources the two books that I went over, as well as some decolonial thinkers that I have been influenced by, people that I've read and have taken courses with. Aníbal Quijano, who's a Peruvian sociologist, who's known for coining the term coloniality of power, and defines it as an ongoing system guided by racism and capitalism. And Professor Ramon Grusfugel, who is a professor in ethnic studies at UC Berkeley, who coined decoloniality and provides a critique of Western-centric, Christian-centric, capitalistic, patriarchal, modern colonial world systems. So that's the end of my webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you for your time.